The dusty town of Red Hollow had always been a place of transactions. Money for cattle, cattle for land, land for blood, and blood for silence. As a rancher who worked honest fields and tended the earth with his own hands, Ethan Marlow knew that every deal had a cost, and for years he believed he could outrun the ghosts of unpaid. That's by burying them beneath fences and sun-baked furrows. But Red Hollow had a way of keeping receipts, and on a sweltering evening at the end of summer, when the sky bruised itself with orange and violet, the man who owned half the region's water supply rode into Ethan's yard, his boots dripping dust and his smile sharp enough to slit throats. That man was Victor Halloran, a figure whose reputation clung to the saloon walls in whispers. And when he dismounted his coal-black stallion and stepped toward Ethan, he carried the smell of whiskey, gunpowder, and opportunity. Ethan had borrowed from Victor 3 years earlier, believing the rains would return, believing the harvest would fill wagons, believing life would reward those who tried. But belief had dried out faster than creek beds, and now Victor was here to collect. Ethan gripped the worn handle of the pitchfork he'd been using and asked, voice low as thunder, "I said I'd pay you back when the season turned," and Victor laughed, a low cracked sound that carried like rattlesnake tails, gesturing toward the barren land where dust devils twirled like spirits, saying, "Season never turned. Marlow fortune doesn't wait for men like you." And behind Victor, 2 of his riders stood like shadows, rifles gleaming in twilight, the kind of reminder that negotiations with him had to forms, agreement or graves. Ethan swallowed his pride and offered the only thing he had, his cattle, meager as they were, and Victor waved the idea away as if swatting a fly, eyes gleaming with something colder, predatory, something that made Ethan feel like livestock himself. Then Victor made the offer, quiet as a knife sliding from a sheath, take her as payment for the debt. And Ethan's first instinct was revulsion mixed with disbelief, for behind Victor stood a young woman, a girl, hardly 20, with wrists bound in braided leather and a face smudged by travel and tears. She stared at the ground as if the dust was safer than the eyes around her, and her raven hair hung in a tangled curtain across her cheeks, her shoulders trembling with exhaustion. Ethan stepped back, spirit recoiling from the suggestion, because a man could be desperate, but he refused to become an animal who accepted flesh as currency. And he spat on the dirt, telling Victor he'd rather lose the land than accept a person as payment. Victor shrugged, unconcerned, as though the moral struggle of another man was a bar fight he didn't want to join. And he reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a paper legal, stamped, titled, folded like a coffin lid, promising that if Ethan didn't settle the debt, the county would carve up his property and auction it to strangers who had never bled here. The riders behind him shifted, and one of them muttered, "Take the girl or lose everything." And Ethan felt the heat rise in his throat, not of anger but of helplessness, the kind that crushes lungs and steals breath the way drought steals crop. He turned to the girl, frustrated that she had become proof of his failure. But then she lifted her head, and for the first time he saw her eyes not empty, not broken, but burning like dim coals clinging to life in a cold hearth. It changed something in him, like a gunshot fired inside his ribs, because those eyes weren't asking for rescue or pity, they were daring him to decide what kind of man he truly was. And suddenly the words of refusal stuck in his throat, frozen between morality and survival, because this wasn't an exchange for pleasure or ownership, it was a test, and he felt his spine bending under the weight of it. He imagined Victor turning her loose to God knew what fate, sold again, beaten, tossed like a tool, and the thought twisted Ethan's stomach until he whispered, "What's her name?" which made Victor smile wide enough to show gold teeth. The man said her name was Aria, which sounded ancient and wild and far too gentle for the cruelty of Red Hollow. And Ethan stepped forward, not quite accepting but not turning away, his calloused hands trembling as he reached for the knot binding her. He expected her to flinch, but instead she froze him with a steady glare, her voice cracking but fierce as she said, "I'm not payment time." A person, and Ethan's breath hitched at the steel buried beneath her exhaustion. Victor scoffed, "She's a debt I'm tired of carrying. Take her or I take your home." And Ethan untied the knot, his fingers shaking like leaves in wind. And Aria stepped toward him, not clutching his arm or shrinking away, but standing beside him as if staking a claim on dignity itself. Victor smirked and tossed the paper to the ground, telling Ethan he had until sunset to months from now to repay the remainder of the debt. Otherwise the land would still be his, and he'd take the girl back with interest. And just like that, Victor mounted his stallion, his men trailing behind him like wolves, leaving Ethan and Aria in the fading light. Silence rolled in, suffocating and awkward, and Ethan finally forced out, "If you want to leave, I'll take you to the stage station tomorrow." But Aria didn't answer. She walked toward the corral, eyes scanning the empty pasture as though choosing where to place her heart. Ethan followed, half afraid she might run, half afraid she wouldn't, until she finally murmured, "You grow things here," and he blinked, confused, nodding slowly. She continued, voice raw, "Then this land is kinder than Victor ever was." And Ethan didn't know whether to laugh or weep. Inside the cabin, the shadows lengthened like serpents as night came on, and Ethan lit a lantern, setting out a bowl of stew, unsure whether she would eat it or throw it in his face. Aria sat across from him, posture rigid, hands folded in her lap, and he noticed bruises around her wrists, old ones, faded like desert twilight, and anger curled through him, as sharp as barbed wire. "Did he hurt you?" Ethan asked, and she replied, "Not in ways that heal," which was an answer he'd spend days unraveling. She told him that she'd been raised in a border town, father dead from sickness, mother taken by raiders, sold to men who bought misery like cattle and moved it from one owner to the next. Victor took her not for pleasure, but as leverage, a body on a ledger, and when she escaped once, he hunted her down like a horse that bolted from its stable. Ethan apologized, though he knew apologies were useless currency, and she said she didn't want pity, only a chance to work, to exist, to sleep without fear. He agreed to give her shelter, but with no promises, because he didn't understand who she was or what he was inviting into his life, only that turning away would rot him from the inside. That night, storm clouds rolled in, and dust hit the windows in hard rattling waves, and Ethan lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how the universe had pinned him between ethics and survival. He wasn't a saint, and the girl wasn't a prize, but something about her presence had already taken root in the soil of his mind, unsettling him. Dawn struck like a silver hammer, and the sound of hoofbeats dragged Ethan outside with his rifle ready. But it wasn't Victor, it was Sheriff Amos Calder, a man who believed the law was whatever powerful men paid him to enforce. He asked about Victor's visit, claiming he had the right legal and moral to check the welfare of property transferred on a debt, and Ethan nearly swung the rifle at his skull. Aria stepped forward and stood behind Ethan, and the sheriff raised his eyebrows at her defiance, saying, "You don't want trouble, girl," and she answered with fire, "I've already lived it," words that struck Ethan like thunderclap. Calder warned Ethan that harboring her beyond the terms could be seen as theft, and Ethan replied only with silence, the kind that said he'd rather fill the sheriff with lead than allow another threat. Eventually Calder rode off, spitting dust and curses, leaving the ranch in uneasy peace. Ethan watched Aria work the next week. She watered the remaining cattle, organized tools, moved quietly as though afraid the land might reject her. But there was grace in her hands and resilience in her back, and even the horses grew calm around her. He found himself asking her questions he hadn't asked anyone in years, whether she slept well, whether she liked the stew he cooked, whether she'd ever seen the ocean, and her answers were short at first, guarded, as though every sentence cost her a memory she'd rather bury. But the longer she stayed, the more that edge softened, until one evening she said she used to sing to herself in the dark, to stop the silence from eating her alive. Ethan urged her to sing then, sitting by the corral post as stars spilled across the sky. And she did, voice quiet and trembling at first, then growing stronger, a song of loss and earth and wind, something ancient that wrapped around him like the scent of rain after drought. By the time she finished, Ethan's eyes stung, and she saw it, offering a half smile as if surprised she had shaken a grown man. Weeks passed, and wolves killed 2 of his calves, forcing them to ride deep into the canyons to chase them off. Aria handled the rifle like someone who knew what death looked like, firing warning shots that sent the predators fleeing. Ethan rode beside her, startled by the fearlessness in her posture, and he asked where she learned to shoot. She gave no clear answer, only said, "You learn things when you don't have a choice." and the words haunted him well into the night. Seasons shifted in slow, uneasy increments, and he found himself looking at her differently, not as a debt and not as a burden, but as something fragile and powerful, a force that had grabbed hold of his life and refused to let go. Sometimes they argued about work, about the sheriff, about how many fences to repair, and in those arguments, she was alive in a way that made him feel the world wasn't just survival and dirt. Then one morning, 2 riders appeared on the ridge wearing the same symbols as Victor's men, and Aria's face turned pale stone as she whispered, "He's coming for what he thinks he owns," and Ethan swore, clenching his fists, because he understood something now. Victor didn't trade people, he broke them, and Ethan would rather burn the ranch than let that man take her. As dusk settled, Ethan sat on the porch, watching orange fire lick the hills, thinking about the moment Victor first offered her like livestock and how everything inside him had shifted when she raised her eyes to meet his. She had come into his life as a debt, but now she was something else, proof that a man was measured not by what he could buy, but by what he would protect even when it cost him everything. And as the night wind pressed against the windows and coyotes called from the ravines, Ethan realized that when the time came, he would not give her up, not to Victor, not to the sheriff, not to the barren hunger that ruled Red Hollow, because he had already chosen. And when he looked at her, everything had changed. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the Heartland Diaries for more powerful, Wild West narratives that touch the soul and keep you on the edge of your seat.